Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. The problems in Kenya of the violence have continued. They are street violence. The root cause of it is government's decision to increase taxes, which the ordinary people in Kenya felt was too much. What is interesting here is not so much the details of the root causes of the violence in Kenya, because I don't want to pretend that I understand them, but that Zimbabweans out there, from judging from the communications or social media, have been looking at what is happening there with something one would even come close to calling envy. They envy the people in Kenya for having the courage to go on the streets and have the street protests. That's how utterly desperate the nation has become. Desperate for change, that they would embrace what is happening in Kenya as honorable and a way out. The tragedy for Zimbabwe, of course, is that the country, the people, have been frustrated for 44 years. Zimbabwe has failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections. And thus, the people have never had any meaningful say in the governance of the country. And in those 44 years, the regime, Zanu PF, has promised them economic prosperity from the days of Mugabe, of Kusarushinji. And yet, it has been on a steady path of economic decline. And that decline has been even steeper than ever before in the last 10 years. Corruption has become rampant in Zimbabwe. Mismanagement, gross mismanagement. The country's infrastructure, like it or not, have been neglected for so long, most of them are crumbling. The country's health and the education system have all but collapsed, particularly in the rural areas. This is how desperate the people have become. This is a short clip of some of the violence in Nairobi. Is acts of desperation. It really is tragic that any country at all, should be forced into this kind of situation. What has got to be remembered here is that these street protests rarely, if ever at all, deliver the good governance the nation wants. acts of violence. It doesn't matter. It could be street protests. It could be a coup, or in our case, of liberation. It does not necessarily deliver a democratic dispensation. Indeed, in our case, the war of liberation is the reason why we are in this mess. It was Gandhi and his fellow Indian leaders who, in the 1940s, when they were faced by a similar challenge, should they launch a military uprising to end British rule of India? Gandhi and friends said no. And they asked the rhetorical question, what kind of leaders would an armed struggle throw up? And the follow-up question, are those the people who would want to rule independent India? I think Zimbabweans, we should have asked the same question too. We didn't. And we have had the answer to the two questions. The armed struggle has thrown up the hawks who, when the country gained its independence, sought their reward in the form of they now must rule the country. Instead of freedom fighters, we had mercenaries, whether we like to admit it or not. That's what we had. When Robert Mugabe and his friends fought for the liberation war, at the end of it, they genuinely believed that they had the divine right to rule the country. And they've rigged elections ever since. They could not think of any situation where they could be voted out of office. Any possibility of that, they eliminated it immediately. In 1980, Zanu PF signed the Lancaster House Agreement, which gave a democratic constitution. But on their way back from the UK, going back to Zimbabwe, they hatched a plan. Although the Lancaster House Agreement said all liberation parties that had freedom fighters must withdraw the freedom fighters to designated assembly points. Zanu PF, Robert Mugabe and his Zanu PF friends made the decision that they were not going to withdraw their freedom fighters. Not all of them. They left a significant number of them in the field. And they were given the instructions during the campaign period that they should tell the ordinary people that if Zanu PF does not win those 1980 elections, the Bush war would continue. Of course, the people voted to end the Bush war. And if anyone believed that that was just a campaign gimmick, as some people did, that misconception was quickly forgotten in 1983 when this Zanu PF-led Zimbabwe government launched the infamous Gukurahundi massacre. Kukura was directed at forcing the then Dr. Joshua Nkomo and his SAPO friends to give up their aspiration for being a separate political party contesting elections with a hope of one day winning power in those elections. That was the purpose of it. And indeed, they succeeded because in the end, Zanu PF relented and signed the 1987 Unit Accord, which cleared the way for Zanu PF to impose the de facto one-party state, which has ruled the country to this day. Zimbabweans have every reason to look at what is happening in Kenya with envy. Because how else are they going to change? To have meaningful change in Zimbabwe. If you have no meaningful votes, how else are you going to achieve change? Last year, Zanu PF blatantly rigged those elections. Even the regional body, SADC, and the continental body, AU, condemned those elections as flawed and illegal. Confirming that the ordinary Zimbabweans cannot have regime change in Zimbabwe through the ballot. So it is understandable why one would see these young men and women thinking, well, we should have a similar thing as the key people in Kenya are doing. How else are we going to change this regime? Indeed, the only meaningful change that has ever happened in the last 44 years was in 2017, when Mnangagwa and his colleagues staged a military coup. But at the end of the day, of course, that didn't change much, because all the country managed to do was swap one dictator and a few around him for another dictator. The opportunity to end the Zanu PF dictatorship was there. I think this is a fundamental point that most Zimbabweans out there fail to understand. The opportunity to end the Zanu PF dictatorship was there. The best chance was during the 2008 to 2018 GNU. SADC had forced Robert Mugabe and Zanu PF to sign the Global Political Agreement of 2008, in which Zanu PF was forced to form a government of national unity whose primary purpose was to implement the democratic reforms to make sure that future elections are free, fair, and credible. The partners in the GNU were expected to implement the reforms were the MDC, the two MDC factions, one led by Morgan Tsvangirai, the other one initially by Atham Tabara, and then later on by Wolfman Nube. The tragedy is, in all the 5 years of the GNU, MDC leaders failed to implement even one token reform. Not even one. Mugabe bribed them with the trappings of high office, very generous salaries and allowances. And for Morgan Tsvangirai, the US 4 million Highlands mansion. And in return, they forgot about the reforms. So the violence, street protests, if we should have them in Zimbabwe, at the present moment, one can understand why some people are seeing it as the only way to bring about meaningful change in Zimbabwe. Who should be blamed for it? Well, Zanu PF. For 40 years, 44 years rather, of rigged elections. And MDC, Triple C, for 24 years, including 5 in the GNU, of not only failing to implement even one token reform, but for participating in flawed elections, knowing fully well that Zanu PF was rigging the elections, knowing fully well that participating would only give Zanu PF legitimacy. And still they participated out of greed, because they also knew that Zanu PF would be giving away a few gravity seats to entice the opposition to participate. I think if the lists of who to blame, if Zimbabwe should find itself in the situation where there is street protests or another coup or some form of violence to end the Zanu PF dictatorship. Like I said, the number one to blame is Zanu PF, number two, MDC. But the list will not be complete. One does not admit that we, ordinary Zimbabweans, are to blame for it too. Why have you been participating in flawed elections, particularly when we have been warned so many times that the process is flawed? That by participating, we will be giving Zanu PF legitimacy. Why have we been so ignorant, naive, and gullible that millions were conned into participating in these flawed elections by blatantly idiotic, in fact, lies from the likes of Chamisa, claiming that he has got winning in rigged election strategies. Last year's strategy was that I plugged all the vote rigging loopholes, and people believed it. In 2018, he claimed that MDC alliance has stringent measures to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. Of course, he was lying. We didn't learn anything from it. And so last year, when he lied again, millions of people believed it. Governments, the people get the government they deserve. I think there is a fundamental truth in that, particularly in our case. We, Zimbabweans, deserve this corrupt, incompetent, and tyrannical Zanu PF, complete with his sidekick, the MDC, Triple C, which is equally corrupt and incompetent and utterly useless. If Zimbabweans do not do something to make sure that 2028 elections are free, fair, and credible, then the least we should do is make sure that we do not participate in our millions in that flawed elections to give Zanu PF legitimacy. That is, if we are not overcome by events, the level of corruption in Zimbabwe today is mind-boggling. It's dragging the whole nation deeper and deeper into this economic hell on earth. I, for one, would not be surprised at all to hear the next minute that there is street protests in Zimbabwe or another military coup. Out of desperation, people want change, and they can resort to violence. Before I close, I thought I should play a video clip of President Ruto of Kenya announcing a compromise with the people of Kenya.
Of our country, again together. And this will be on matters that are contained in the bill and matters that the people of Kenya have canvassed in the conversation that has been going on. In this regard as well, I am directing for immediate further austerity measures to reduce expenditure, starting with the office of the president, the entire presidency, and extending to the entire executive arm of government. Operational expenditure in the presidency be reduced to remove allocations for the confidential fort, reduce travel, hospitality, purchase of motor vehicles, renovations, and other expenditures. This will cover the entire presidency and also the executive arm of government. I also propose that equally, Parliament, the judiciary, and county governments, working with the National Treasury, also undertake budget cuts and austerity to ensure that we do live within our means, respecting the very loud message that is coming from the people of Kenya. And let me confirm that I have discussed with many stakeholders. I will be meeting some of them shortly after this meeting on charting a way forward that makes sure that we carry the whole nation in this very important journey as we go into the future as a country. Let me also confirm that as we deal with austerity, the loud message on dealing firmly, decisively, and expeditiously with corruption is a matter that we have discussed and we have agreed that it will take the front banner as we go into the future. We will continue to do this and carry out this very important conversation. And I want to remind us that we should proceed within the foundational principles upon which our nation is founded, namely constitutionalism, adherence to the rule of law, and respect for constitutional institutions. We must continue to operate within the parameters of the law. I thank you.
I think if one was to draw a parallel with the Zanu PF regime, one could not fail to realize that the government in Kenya was duly elected. Yes, there were some oppositions who complained about the elections not being free, fair, and credible. But I think the voices of the majority was that the elections were free, fair, and credible. In the case of Zimbabwe, 2023 elections were not free, fair, and credible. The regional body, SADC, the continental body, AU, all condemned the election process as flawed. So the number one thing for Zimbabwe is we have an illegitimate government. And this illegitimate government is not going to implement any meaningful reforms. Oh, no doubt. In fact, it claims and maintains that the 2023 elections were free, fair, and credible. A clear sign that they're not willing to change. So the promise I would want from the Zanu PF government is that 2028 elections must be free, fair, and credible. And let's appoint a body whose task would be to make sure that those elections are free, fair, and credible. We cannot, as a nation, continue in this madness of 44 years of rigged elections. It's an outrage. In this day and age, we know what constitutes free, fair, and credible elections. Why is it that we're failing to deliver it? As for Mnangagwa promising that he will stamp out corruption, I think we all, any Zimbabwean within half a brain would laugh at that because we've heard him say that. In fact, that was one of the two big promises he made in 2017 when he got into power, that there will be zero tolerance on corruption. But we know that corruption has become even worse under his watch than it was during Mugabe's time. When you hear that as much as 80% of the country's gold is smuggled out of the country so that the country does not benefit anything from it, that's when you realize the seriousness of our problem. Mnangagwa cannot stamp out corruption because he is the godfather of corruption. The best hope for Zimbabwe is that we have a body that will see to it that all the meaningful democratic reforms are implemented before the 2028 elections. If no such body is appointed, then the people of Zimbabwe must not participate in the 2028 elections, because they will only be giving Zanu PF legitimacy. We have the final say in this. And I think we need to sit up and pay attention for a change. It is tragic that over 2 million of us were easily conned by Chamisa idiotic promise that he had plugged the vote rigging loopholes. And we participated only to give Zanu PF legitimacy. Like I said, we have played our part in keeping the Zanu PF dictatorship in power. And until we wake up and take ownership of that issue, I don't see a way out of this mess. And let me emphasize, I do not believe that street protests or a military coup or a combination of the two will deliver the good governance the nation has been dying for. All violent solutions are unpredictable. The end result is unpredictable. In the case of Kenya, if President Ruto honors his promise and seriously address some of the big issues that are affecting Kenya, the economic performance, he may have put Kenya back on the recovery path for the good of the country. I do not see Mnangagwa doing the same thing. It is not in his DNA to come up with such a compromise. The compromise we would want him to make right now is that let's have the reforms implemented to ensure that elections are free, fair, and credible. Mnangagwa will never make such a compromise. Food for thought. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good day.